The stale breath of the ventilation system was a constant companion in the labyrinthine, windowless corridors of the Federal Agency for Anomalous Threats. It was a smell Alex Morgan knew intimately, a peculiar blend of recycled air, ozone, and the bitter, metallic tang of day-old coffee that clung to everything, from the synthetic carpets to the very fabric of his uniform shirt. For years, he had navigated these underground passages, deep beneath an innocuous federal building, a place designed to exist in the liminal space between public knowledge and classified nightmare. He was a cog in a vast machine, a former analyst of considerable promise, now subsumed by the relentless grind of what the agency called the beast dossiers, a sanitized bureaucratic term for anything and everything connected to the escalating werewolf attacks across the United States. He clung to the illusion of order with the desperation of a man dangling over an abyss, believing that by organizing the chaos enough, it would cease to be chaotic. The archives, a sprawling underground catacomb of steel shelving and climate-controlled cabinets, were a grim testament to humanity's ongoing war with the unknown. They housed the physical manifestations of horror, countless dusty folders, their edges frayed, their contents a morbid inventory of suffering. Inside, Alex had seen grainy, often out-of-focus photographs of mangled bodies, frozen in grotesque tableaus of agony. The victims' faces, where discernible, wore expressions of unspeakable terror, a silent scream captured in monochrome. There were also the transcripts of survivors' interrogations. Their accounts often fragmented, stuttering, riddled with the kind of primal fear that shredded coherence. Each red dot on the massive wall-mounted map of the continental United States represented an attack, a flashpoint of violence. Each, according to the agency's official doctrine, was a random manifestation of a wild, uncontrolled threat. The agency's prevailing theory, a comforting lie spun out of sheer incomprehension, was simple enough for the men and women on the front lines to grasp. Werewolves were rare, mutated predators, their attacks chaotic, unpredictable, driven by some base, animalistic hunger. The mission, as Alex had understood it, was to classify these attacks, to find patterns in their seeming randomness, and to develop strategies that the military could then use to eliminate the threat. He had believed in that simple, reassuring lie with all the fervor of a true believer. It was a narrative that offered control, a sense of purpose in the face of absolute terror. His role, a crucial one in the agency's intricate web, was to construct these combat strategies. He meticulously pored over every report, every photograph, every piece of available data, hoping to discern a logical sequence, a predictable rhythm in the violence where none seemed to exist. It was his mission, his quiet contribution to the safety of the nation, and for a long time, he had felt a profound, almost sacred pride in it. He was the architect of reason in a world teetering on the brink of unreason. The invitation to join a field operation in the rolling farmlands of Iowa, as a mere observer, had been a rare and unexpected opportunity for a desk-bound analyst like Alex. He remembered the surge of excitement, a genuine thrill that transcended the sterile confines of the bunker. He had anticipated the trip would provide irrefutable confirmation of his painstakingly developed theories, a chance to witness the beast firsthand, to contribute directly to its capture and ultimate elimination. The thought of being a part of the real action, of seeing his red dots come to life, had filled him with a potent cocktail of anticipation and righteous purpose. The team, a seasoned squad of Special Forces operatives, had taken up a camouflaged position on a remote cattle farm, nestled deep within the Iowa backcountry. The air hung heavy with the smells of wet earth, manure, and the metallic tang of an approaching autumn storm. A monotonous, chilling rain fell, drumming a steady rhythm on the synthetic fabric of their hooded ponchos. Its insistent patter drowned out the subtle whispers of the surrounding woods. The nervousness emanating from each soldier was a palpable thing, a taut, vibrating string that thrummed through the damp air. It was infectious, tightening Alex's own stomach into a cold knot. The silence, punctuated only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the occasional crackle of a two-way radio, was a heavy, oppressive blanket that pressed down on their eardrums, magnifying every rustle of leaves, every drip of water. Alex had felt a distinct premonition, a cold sliver of unease, but he'd brushed it aside, attributing it to the unfamiliar adrenaline of a live operation, the raw excitement of being on the cusp of something monumental. Then the radio squawked, a sudden jarring burst of static in the suffocating quiet. The voice on the other end was trembling, thin with shock and something akin to disbelief. The message was delivered in clipped, disbelieving tones. The attack had occurred. Not here. Not in Iowa. It had happened in a different state, 1,000 miles away from their position in the humid, thick woods of North Carolina. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Their carefully constructed predictions, the precise algorithms, the meticulously compiled data, all of it had crumbled into dust. All their painstaking work, all the red dots and the statistical analysis had been utterly and completely false. A cold, insidious realization, as chilling and pervasive as the autumn rain that now plastered his poncho to his skin, pierced Alex to the bone. It was an awareness of the agency's profound, almost criminal incompetence, a stunning admission that everything they thought they knew was a lie. This was the first deep crack, an irreparable fissure that ran through the very foundation of his belief system, shattering the illusion of order he had so carefully constructed. The flight back to the base was an exercise in oppressive silence. The helicopter cabin, usually a hive of chatter and the low hum of nervous energy, now felt like a lead coffin. The rhythmic thrum of the rotors was a monotonous, inescapable backdrop to the team's collective despair. Their faces, etched with fatigue and a bitter disappointment, were a study in silent recrimination. Shame and anger simmered beneath the surface, a volatile cocktail of emotions that made the air thick and heavy. Alex, for his part, felt utterly duped, a fool who had swallowed the agency's comforting lies whole. His analytical mind, accustomed to precision and logic, simply could not reconcile itself with such a monumental public failure. It gnawed at him, a persistent, ugly truth that refused to be dismissed. Colonel Hank, the department head, had convened a perfunctory debriefing, a sterile affair held in a windowless conference room where the fluorescent lights hummed with an almost malicious intensity. He summarily dismissed the entire fiasco, attributing it to data inaccuracy and the unpredictability of the predators. Yet, even in his crisp, authoritative voice, Alex detected a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, a hollowness that revealed a deep underlying lack of conviction. The colonel's words, meant to reassure, only deepened Alex's internal dissonance. His finely honed logical instincts screamed that the spectacular failure in Iowa could not have been a mere coincidence, an isolated anomaly. It felt too clean, too precise in its wrongness. He began to understand that it was not an error in their methods, but rather a profound, systemic pattern, one they had been deliberately blind to, obscured by their own preconceived notions and the comforting dogma of the agency. This insidious thought, once a whisper, rapidly grew into an all-consuming obsession. His nights, once reserved for the shallow sleep of the overworked, became a new kind of duty. The agency's underground bunker, a place of quiet industry by day, transformed into a cavern of eerie silence after midnight, punctuated only by the low, insistent hum of the server banks. Alex, a clandestine operator within the system, meticulously picked at the edges of old, officially closed files, documents deemed resolved and irrelevant, but to which he still had access as a senior analyst. He searched for any anomalies, any unexplained incidents that had been conveniently ignored, swept under the rug of official reports. His personal computer, a high-end, agency-issued model, became his sanctuary, a clandestine repository for the shadow data he was uncovering, a digital shrine to his growing paranoia. That paranoia, once a vague unease, rapidly became his constant companion. He started noticing things. A colleague's gaze lingered a fraction too long. An office door clicked softly just as he passed. The air subtly shifted when he entered a room. He could not discern the source. He felt the agency's desperation to control him, to ensure his silence. He sensed something far more sinister, an entity whose reach extended beyond the confines of government oversight, an entity that had finally recognized him as a threat. The ambiguity was a chilling weight on his soul. He began to cross-reference data that had previously been considered disparate, unconnected pieces of a shattered puzzle. He analyzed not only the geography and timing of the attacks, but also the types of victims, their ages, occupations, social statuses. He paid close attention to the specific nature of the wounds, the chilling peculiarities found at crime scenes. Everything that had once been carelessly dismissed as the wildness of the beast. He noted the deliberate dismemberment, the curious lack of consumption, the almost surgical precision of some of the injuries. It was as if the perpetrators were making a statement, a grim message etched in blood and bone. What he found was a horrifying confirmation of his deepening suspicion. He uncovered several other instances of erroneous predictions, failures strikingly similar to the Iowa incident, but which had been conveniently reinterpreted as isolated shortcomings easily explained away by the agency's official narrative. Now, viewed through the chilling lens of his new perspective, they no longer appeared as isolated events. They looked like interconnected links in a single malevolent chain, a dark thread that wove its way through decades of classified reports, through generations of human suffering. The idea of randomness, the agency's foundational lie, finally cracked and shattered. Alex realized that this was not chaos. It was an incredibly complex, terrifyingly intelligent strategy, executed with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic. His personal investigation, once a logical pursuit, had transformed into an all-consuming obsession, an insidious force that utterly displaced his sleep, his peace, and slowly, irrevocably, his sanity. He was digging a hole for himself, a deep, dark one, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that there would be no climbing out. Ignoring every official protocol, every stringent guideline etched into the agency's hallowed policy manuals, Alex Morgan embarked on a rogue mission. He began constructing his own hidden databases, clandestine repositories of information squirreled away on encrypted drives and obscure network servers, invisible to the prying eyes of the Federal Agency for Anomalous Threats Information Technology Department. His objective was no longer to pinpoint geographical hotspots, those familiar red dots on the national map. No, his aim was far more insidious, far more terrifying. He sought hotlines, intricate, invisible connections that linked the victims not by proximity, but by something far more fundamental. He worked under the cloak of night, a solitary figure illuminated only by the pallid glow of his computer screen, feeling like a phantom hacker operating within the very heart of his own agency, a subversive presence in the supposed bastion of order. His fingers flew across the keyboard, a relentless dance of inquiry and data extraction. He delved deeper, past the surface-level demographics and attack specifics, into the murky waters of public records and forgotten archives. What he uncovered sent a cold tremor through his very bones. He discovered that many of the victims, seemingly scattered across the vast expanse of the country, had shared the same, often remarkably rare surnames. Further, more painstaking research into open-source records and genealogical websites revealed an even more unsettling truth. These disparate individuals across states and generations were connected by common ancestors. This was no mere coincidence. This was a pattern, a genetic thread weaving through the tapestry of their doomed lives. These were connections, stark and undeniable, that bound the dead together in a grim, silent fraternity. On his clandestine map, a digital creation hidden deep within his personal network, he began to plot not only the locations of the attacks, but also the genealogical relationships between the victims. Red lines, thin as capillaries, then thick as veins, snaked across the virtual landscape, connecting points that had once appeared utterly disparate, forming a terrifyingly coherent, albeit utterly chilling schematic. It was a macabre family tree, meticulously pruned by an unseen, monstrous hand. The pattern that emerged was horrific in its precision, a testament to an intelligence that transcended human understanding. Alex also meticulously reanalyzed the methods of attack, the chilling signatures left behind by the perpetrators. He noted, with a growing sense of dread, that unlike common predatory animals, the bodies of the victims were frequently left largely untainted in terms of consumption. Instead, they were often disfigured in specific, sometimes ritualistic ways. Some victims were dispatched with a brutal, lightning-fast efficiency, their lives extinguished in a single, horrifying burst of violence. Others, however, had clearly undergone prolonged, agonizing torment, their bodies bearing the marks of a deliberate, targeted brutality, as if their suffering itself were a crucial component of the act. The methods varied, but the common thread was the absence of a simple predatory hunger. This was not about food. It was about something far more ancient and terrifying. Using his dwindling agency access to old county registries and a growing array of public genealogical sites, Alex unearthed another disturbing truth. These targeted surnames, those families relentlessly pursued by the monsters, had appeared in the same regions, sometimes even in the same specific towns or hamlets for generations. This suggested a profound, deeply entrenched historical root to the problem, a legacy of terror stretching back centuries, passed down through blood and soil. This was not a modern phenomenon. It was an ancient one. In moments of desperation, fueled by his mounting discoveries, he tried to subtly hint at his findings to a few trusted colleagues. Then, emboldened by the weight of his evidence, to a mid-level supervisor. His revelations were met with a dismissive wave of the hand, a patronizing smile. He was told he was overworked, that he was imagining threats where there were not any. Coincidence, Alex. Just coincidence they casually tossed his way, their voices devoid of any genuine concern, their eyes already sliding back to their own reports, their own comforting illusions. It was a cold wall of indifference, a terrifying confirmation of his increasing isolation. This was no chaotic hunt, no random, animalistic slaughter. This was a targeted systemic obliteration of specific bloodlines, of particular families. Something was cleaning a list, methodically and with chilling purpose. The realization that the beast possessed a terrifying intelligence, a calculated, purposeful strategy, proved far more horrifying than any imagined chaos. Chaos, at least, had no memory, no agenda. This, Alex understood with a dread that settled deep in his bones, had both. It had memory, and it had a mission, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Alex realized, with a chilling clarity that resonated deep within his bones, that to truly validate his burgeoning, terrifying theory, he needed to delve deeper than the last few decades, the limited scope of the Federal Agency for Anomalous Threats contemporary records. He needed history, real history. His previous research, for all its meticulous detail, felt like sifting through the topsoil when the ancient roots of a monstrous tree lay buried far below. So, with a boldness born of desperation and a growing sense of urgency, he infiltrated the agency's deeper archival strongholds. He knew the building better than anyone, its hidden passages and forgotten service tunnels, the places where the concrete felt colder, where the hum of the ventilation system was fainter. He used his carefully cultivated reputation as a forgetful analyst, someone prone to long, solitary hours often lost in the labyrinth of data, as a cloak, slipping into restricted zones under the guise of retrieving a misfiled report or verifying an obscure footnote. The deeper archives were unlike anything he had encountered before. They were colder, damper, permeated by the thick, cloying smell of mold and decaying paper, mixed with something else, something indefinable and ancient, like the scent of dried blood and forgotten curses. The air itself was heavy with the weight of forgotten time. He uncovered old, brittle reports, some bound in deteriorating leather, others in faded canvas, dating back to the late 19th century, even the early 20th. Many were handwritten, the script flowing and elegant, but now rendered almost indecipherable by the passage of decades. The ink faded to a sepia whisper on crumbling parchment. The language was archaic, filled with euphemisms and flowery descriptions that struggled to contain the raw horror of the events they detailed. Mixed in were crude engravings, stark black and white images depicting primeval, terrifying visages of things that clawed and tore, their forms more shadow than substance. To his mounting horror, a cold dread that began as a prickle and soon enveloped him entirely. Alex found the same rare surnames: the very ones he had painstakingly linked in his digital map, recurring with sickening regularity in these ancient reports. And not just the names. The same geographical zones, the same isolated homesteads, the same dark stretches of forest where the horrors had unfolded, echoed through the centuries. The mentions of beasts, unclean things, night terrors, and family curses were always inexorably tied to these specific localities, and more chillingly, to specific individuals within those doomed families. These were not simply repeating events, these were repeating targets, a grim, cyclical harvest. Crucially, in stark contrast to the agency's modern, clinically detached reports, these older documents did not treat the monsters as a random anomaly, a sporadic outbreak of bestial violence. They described their actions as organized, deliberate, and, most chillingly, adhering to incomprehensible yet rigorously applied rules. There was a striking selectivity in their choice of victims, a precision that belied any notion of a rampaging animal. There were even subtle, unsettling hints, almost whispers between the faded lines of the text, of a terrifying hierarchy, of a council that governed these ancient entities, orchestrating their horrific dance across generations. The accounts were often penned by old hunters, by local sheriffs, whose terse reports spoke of unspeakable things, by village priests who scribbled fervent prayers in the margins, and by ordinary folk who had witnessed horrors that defied sanity. All of them, in their various ways, had tried to fight the curse, this malevolent force that preyed upon their communities. They did not understand its true nature, only its terrifying manifestations. They instinctively knew that not everyone was susceptible to its wrath, that certain families, certain individuals were singled out, but they could not explain why. Their struggle was often blind, born of desperation and fear, yet their records, for all their archaic language and superstitious overtones, were astonishingly accurate in their detailing of victims and patterns. A cold, binding terror seized Alex, rooting him to the spot in the dim, dust-laden archive. The agency, with all its modern technology and sophisticated analysis, was not, as it believed, hunting beasts in their random, chaotic manifestation. It was unknowingly tracking a species that had existed, acted, and chosen its victims with terrifying deliberation for centuries, following its own ancient, inexorable plan. This was not a battle. This was a war. A very, very old war. The profound realization of this ancient hidden conflict, this relentless generational culling, separated Alex from his colleagues even more irrevocably. He saw all their efforts, their brave agents, their meticulous reports, as a meaningless, almost farcical ballet, a pantomime of control. Meanwhile, behind the curtain of human ignorance, a multi-century tragedy was unfolding, a grim epic in which humanity played a role it did not even suspect, a part in a play whose script it had never seen. He felt utterly alien among his own kind, a stranger in a world he no longer recognized, haunted by the whispers of ages. Alex, his internal tremor barely controlled, a nervous twitch that manifested in the insistent tapping of his pen against his knee, gathered what he believed to be the most convincing evidence of his burgeoning, terrifying theory. He compiled a meticulously structured presentation, a digital tapestry woven from the threads of ancient reports, modern data, and his own chilling genealogical diagrams. Then, with a desperate courage that verged on recklessness, he requested a meeting with his department head, Colonel Hank. Hank was a man cast from granite, a figure of stern, unwavering skepticism, and Alex knew a deep-seated cynicism that ran bone deep. Yet Alex clung to a fragile hope. He believed that the facts, stark and undeniable, would speak for themselves, even to a man as unyielding as Hank. His presentation met a reception as cold and sharp as a winter gale. Hank, a formidable presence behind a massive dark wood desk that seemed to absorb all light, listened with an expression of thinly veiled distaste, his eyes glinting with boredom. Alex watched him, a slow, sickening dread coiling in his gut, and knew with absolute certainty that the colonel did not believe a single word. More than that, he did not want to believe. The truth, in its raw and terrifying form, was too inconvenient, too disruptive to the comforting edifice of agency dogma. "Do not dig deeper, Alex." Hank's voice was a low, chilling rasp, devoid of any warmth, sharp as a honed blade. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding Alex's gaze in a silent, predatory challenge. "Your task here is to analyze the data presented to you, not to create fantastic theories that destabilize morale. This kind of thinking is detrimental to the department, and frankly, to your own mental health." The threat, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on Alex, cold and suffocating. It was a warning, a dismissal, and a final, brutal push towards the precipice. But Alex, his teeth gritted, found he could not retreat. He felt with a profound and terrifying certainty that he had already crossed a point of no return, a threshold from which there was no turning back to the comfortable ignorance he had once embraced. He returned to his data, to the quiet hum of his computer, the only entity in the world that seemed to listen without judgment. He now understood, with a horrifying clarity, that all those erroneous predictions, those random-seeming failures that had been conveniently dismissed as mere inaccuracies or imperfections in their methods, were in fact precise but profoundly misinterpreted signals. The agency, for all its resources, had seen only the symptoms of a terrible illness, but had remained utterly blind to the true diagnosis, mistaking surface anomalies for the underlying insidious disease. His re-examination of the attack patterns yielded an even more chilling insight. The werewolves, these ancient, horrifying entities, were not hunting humans for sustenance. Their victims were frequently left uneaten, their bodies merely torn, often in ways that defied any simple predatory instinct. They were not just killing, they were selecting. The analogy that kept returning to him, chilling him to the bone, was that of a farmer carefully selecting grains for planting, or a surgeon meticulously excising diseased, infected tissue. It was a ghastly yet terrifyingly logical strategy, a cold, calculated efficiency that elevated the creatures from mindless brutes to something far more sinister. Intelligent arbiters of a grim unseen agenda. As his understanding deepened, so too did his isolation. He began to notice the subtle signs of surveillance, the tightening net around him. His access to certain crucial databases became mysteriously limited, requiring endless calls and permissions that were rarely granted. His colleagues, once cordial, now looked at him with an uncomfortable suspicion, their gazes shifting away when he approached. Their conversations hushed. He had become a pariah, an outcast in the very place he had once found purpose, feeling the pressure mount from all sides, a slow, inexorable squeeze. His nights, when sleep finally claimed him, were no longer a refuge. They were invaded by an escalating series of nightmares. Shifting shadows writhed in unseen forests. Malevolent red eyes gleamed in the darkness. and chilling whispers of ancient, half-forgotten names echoed from the deepest recesses of history. He heard the word curse, not as a vague superstition, but as a palpable living entity that pursued not only the victims he had studied, but now, increasingly, him. He felt with every fiber of his being that he was drawing closer to something unimaginably dangerous, something that had noticed his prying. He had gone from observer to target, an unwitting participant in a game whose rules he was only just beginning to comprehend, and whose stakes were terrifyingly personal. News of a new field operation, a mission to intercept a werewolf in the desolate, forgotten forests of Maine, reached Alex like a cold blast of wind through the cracks of his sealed-off world. Despite his official suspension from active operations, despite the explicit warnings and the palpable chill from Colonel Hank, he found a way to join. He pulled every string he had, called in every favor, and leveraged his dwindling agency contacts, twisting the truth under the guise of providing analytical support for the mission. He knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that he was risking everything: his career, his freedom, his life, but the desperate need for irrefutable proof, for a living, breathing confirmation of his horrific theories, outweighed all else. The heavy rucksack, crammed with standard-issue gear and his own clandestine recording equipment, dug into his shoulders, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of his precarious position. The air in the Maine woods was brutally cold, penetrating his layers of clothing, chilling him to the bone. Every breath was a frosty plume in the pre-dawn gloom. The dominant smells were those of pine needles, wet decaying earth, and the faint, unsettling aroma of something organic and rotten beneath the carpet of leaves, a smell that, to his heightened senses, felt profoundly sinister. The nervousness of the Special Forces operators, usually masked by their steely professionalism, was a palpable thing. A taut, vibrating string that thrummed through the cold air. They were deep in the woods, far from any paved road, far from the comforting artificiality of civilization. Night was a suffocating blanket, the sliver of moon struggling to pierce the dense canopy of ancient trees, casting a confusing mosaic of strange, shifting shadows across the forest floor. A profound, crushing silence descended upon them, broken only by the rustle of their own movements and the faint, hollow thud of their hearts. Suddenly, a sound, almost imperceptible at first, a soft rustle, then the distinct, sharp snap of a dry twig, ripped through the oppressive quiet. Every head snapped up, every muscle tensed. Then an even more terrifying silence fell, deeper and more profound than before, a void that seemed to swallow all ambient noise. Out of the deepest, darkest pocket of shadow, where the moonlight utterly failed to penetrate, E.T. emerged. It was not merely a beast, a feral animal driven by instinct. This was a creature, a towering nightmare entity, its form coalescing from the blackness. Its fur, the color of a moonless midnight, absorbed all light, making it a moving silhouette of pure dread. Its eyes, twin points of malevolent, hellish red fire, burned with an unholy intensity, tracking their every move. The werewolf did not attack immediately. Instead it froze, an impossibly tall, sinewy form rooted to the spot, its head cocked slightly. It scanned them, its red gaze sweeping across each man, studying, assessing their essence, with an unnerving, deliberate intelligence. This was not a rabid predator, driven by blind hunger or rage. This was a rational ancient being making a choice, possessed of its own terrible, terrifying intellect. The sheer predatory intelligence in its eyes was 1,000 times more horrifying than any bestial savagery. The seconds stretched into an eternity of suspended animation, a suffocating vacuum of tense, unbearable silence. Then, with a sudden, impossibly swift lunge, the creature moved. It was a blur of black fur and raw power, an explosion of motion that defied the laws of physics, but it did not rush at the closest or the most threatening operative. It ignored the majority of the Special Forces team, its trajectory precise, deliberate. It hurled itself at one specific soldier. A young man named Stevens, fresh-faced and barely out of training. A choked, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated horror tore from Stevens' throat, quickly followed by a sickening, wet crunch of bone and muscle. The creature tore at his body with a calculated, almost ritualistic ferocity, not consuming, but rending, dismembering with a chilling precision that made Alex's stomach churn. As swiftly as it had attacked, the werewolf disengaged. It did not finish Stevens, nor did it attempt to assault any of the other paralyzed, weapon-wielding soldiers, though it clearly could have. It simply dropped the mangled, bleeding body of the young soldier, a task completed, a grim mission accomplished. Then, with a haunting, almost ethereal silence, it melted back into the deeper shadows of the dense undergrowth, vanishing as utterly and as quickly as it had appeared. Alex watched its receding shadow, a phantom against the dappled moonlight, utterly unable to move, his muscles locked, his mind paralyzed by a horror so profound it bordered on the spiritual. In the ensuing chaos, the shouts, the frantic radio calls, the desperate attempts to aid the dying man, Alex, through the haze of his own terror, noticed something. Stevens, gasping his last, his lifeblood pooling on the damp leaves, mumbled something in a low, choked whisper. It was not a coherent sentence, but Alex, straining, heard his own name, unmistakably, or perhaps the name of another. A familiar one from a family tree he had seen. It was a dying utterance that confirmed his very worst fears, chilling him to his core. The werewolf had known him. It had attacked not randomly, not out of a primal, undirected bloodlust, but by name, by bloodline, fulfilling a cold, ancient purpose. Back at the agency's sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation rooms, the aftermath of Stevens' death proved as brutal as the attack itself, albeit in a different, more insidious way. Alex was subjected to relentless, unforgiving interrogations, the questions sharp, accusatory. He was accused of unauthorized entry into a live field operation, of gross violation of protocol, and, most damningly, of exhibiting psychological instability in the face of the enemy. He tried, in his dazed state, to explain his dawning insights, to share the chilling revelation that Stevens's death had been no random act, but a targeted execution. His pleas were met with cold dismissal, his observations waved away as the predictable ramblings of post-traumatic stress, a convenient explanation for his inconvenient truths. They simply did not want to hear it. Driven by a desperate, almost manic energy, Alex plunged back into his clandestine research with renewed vigor. His personal computer became an extension of his frantic mind, its screen his window into a reality few dared to glimpse. He began to cross-reference the agency's vast archives of attacks with the sprawling, tangled branches of genealogical trees, a grim librarian of death. He exploited every loophole in the agency's security systems, bypassed blocks on restricted databases with a hacker's finesse, diving ever deeper into the most classified corners of federal records. His small, cluttered desk, now his fortress against the world, disappeared under an avalanche of printouts, fragmented family trees, and meticulously organized index cards, each one a thread in the terrifying tapestry he was weaving. He meticulously constructed complex diagrams, not just connecting points on a map, but tracing entire bloodlines, lines of descent that stretched back through centuries of human history. He unearthed a truly astonishing, bone-chilling pattern. The werewolves were systematically cutting out specific lineages, pruning them with a cold, precise efficiency, as if following a long-established pre-made list. It was a methodical generational culling, a relentless purge of certain blood, not random acts of savagery, but a grim, calculated harvest. Further investigation yielded another deeply unsettling discovery. He found instances of families who had lived in the same remote villages, sometimes even sharing fences with the targeted families, yet whose bloodlines had inexplicably never been subjected to a single attack. This, he realized, was no mere accident. This was irrefutable proof of a strict, horrifying criterion of selection, a set of rules and distinctions understood only by the werewolves themselves. It hinted at a profound, almost genetic difference between those who were hunted and those who were spared. He searched, with a desperate, almost feverish intensity, for the unifying factor, the invisible thread that connected the doomed. He sought a specific genetic marker, a dormant gene passed down through generations, an ancient curse, a malevolent seed embedded in their very genetic code, or a terrifying predisposition, an inherent quality that marked them for eradication. His analytical mind, accustomed to finding order in chaos, struggled to comprehend this new, terrifying order, this selective destruction. In a moment of profound despair, Alex turned to an unlikely ally, a wizened, half-blind archivist named Martha. She was an agency legend, a living relic who knew every hidden cranny and forgotten corner of the old archives, her memory a steel trap for historical minutiae. She was a woman of quiet dignity and unwavering principles, and something in Alex's desperate sincerity resonated with her. Against all rules, against all personal risk, she quietly, almost secretively, granted him access to additional, long-forgotten historical dossiers, dusty tomes filled with records that had been gathering mold in the deepest, most secure vaults for decades. It was in these ancient, forbidden texts that the full, horrifying truth coalesced. Alex realized with a clarity that threatened to shatter his sanity that the werewolves were not merely wild animals, not simply mutated predators. They were the executors of an ancient, cold, and unimaginably terrifying plan. They were, in a chilling inversion of his earlier understanding, a kind of executioner, working tirelessly by an unknown but rigorously enforced sentence. They were the arbiters of fate, passing judgment on bloodlines, ensuring the continuation of a horrifying millennia-old purge. He was no longer hunting monsters. He was uncovering a truth that would change everything, a truth that transformed predators into something far more profound and terrifying. The hammer blow came swiftly and without ceremony. Alex was officially suspended from all active operations, his access to classified data revoked with the cold efficiency of a digital guillotine. He was called into Colonel Hank's office, the air in the room thick with unspoken judgment. He received an offer for a long, much-needed vacation or a transfer to a different, less responsible position. A thinly veiled attempt, he knew, to silence him, to isolate him, to bury his inconvenient truths under a mountain of bureaucratic paper. He was purged from the system, deemed a contaminant. His former colleagues, once a source of camaraderie and shared purpose, now actively avoided him. Their gazes, when they accidentally met his, were a mixture of fear and open hostility. Stephen's death, once an anomaly, had been conveniently pinned on Alex's unreliable analysis, his reckless disregard for protocol. He had become the agency's scapegoat, the convenient receptacle for all their failures, a living testament to the dangers of questioning the established order. He was utterly, devastatingly alone. Stripped of the agency's vast resources, cut off from its intricate web of information, Alex was forced to operate in the shadows, a solitary investigator in a world that sought to erase him. He drained his personal savings, converting every last dollar into equipment, secure network access, and the endless cups of coffee that fueled his sleepless nights. He dusted off old contacts from outside the federal agency for anomalous threats. A former college roommate who'd become a cybersecurity expert, a retired historian with a network of arcane knowledge. People who still trusted him, or at least were willing to bend a few rules for a friend in need. Using his formidable hacking skills, honed over years of digital warfare, he continued his investigation, each night donning new, fictitious identities to navigate the labyrinthine digital networks, an unseen digital operative. The paranoia, once a nagging whisper in his mind, had solidified into a chilling reality. He began to notice the telltale signs of surveillance. The same unfamiliar black sedan parked 2 blocks from his apartment for days on end. The same stoic faces appearing with unnerving regularity in the crowds he navigated. There were strange malfunctions in his apartment. The deadbolt on his door suddenly jamming, his internet connection inexplicably cutting out at crucial moments, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that suggested a hidden listening device. He could not discern the source. He felt the agency's desperation to control him, to ensure his silence. He sensed something far more sinister, an entity whose reach extended beyond the confines of government oversight, an entity that had finally recognized him as a threat. The ambiguity was a chilling weight on his soul. To evade the tightening net, Alex abandoned his comfortable, spacious apartment. He moved to a different, humbler dwelling in a forgotten corner of the city, a neglected neighborhood of crumbling brick and peeling paint, far from his usual routes. His new apartment was small, sparsely furnished, deliberately anonymous. His life transformed into a constant quest for invisibility. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk down the street, became a grueling test of his nerves, a meticulous exercise in observation and evasion. He reached out to former colleagues, those who had once expressed quiet doubts about the agency's directives, who had shared a fleeting glance of unease during an especially troubling debriefing. But the truth, when he tried to articulate it, was too much for them. They were terrified. They refused to help, fearing for their careers, for their pensions, for their very lives. The world, once a network of contacts and connections, had shrunk to the confines of his small, lonely apartment. He was surrounded by an impenetrable wall of distrust and fear, an island in a sea of ignorance. The constant stress, the relentless absence of sleep, the insidious, obsessive thoughts of an ancient curse and a monstrous conspiracy began to take their toll. Alex felt his grip on sanity slipping balancing on the jagged edge of madness. Yet the unquenchable thirst for the truth, the desperate aching need to understand, to make sense of the senseless, held him tethered, however tenuously, to reality. He had to understand. He had to finish this. The answers, he knew, lay just beyond the veil of his sanity, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to reach them. The digital key, a convoluted string of alphanumeric characters, gleamed on his screen like a shard of forbidden light. It was Martha, the elderly archivist, her face a map of kindness and weary knowledge, who had provided the initial breadcrumbs, a cryptic hint whispered over a stale coffee in a deserted diner. Combined with his own relentless hacking skills, Alex finally gained access to the agency's most fiercely guarded secret, the so-called Black Files. These were not merely classified documents. They were the repository of the utterly inexplicable, the catalog of the agency's profoundest failures, a collection of data so disturbing it had been hidden even from the majority of federal agency for anomalous threats analysts, stamped with the chilling designation of strictly classified, eyes only. It was a vault of unspeakable truths, a testament to what humanity refused to acknowledge. Within these forbidden files, Alex discovered something that stole his breath, leaving him cold and gasping in his darkened apartment. It was not just a scattered constellation of red dots marking attacks. It was a complex, almost arcane grid, invisibly superimposed upon the map of the United States. This grid, a network of faint, pulsing lines, resonated with the echoes of ancient geodesic patterns, and an unseen metaphysical landscape underlay the familiar topography of the continent. It delineated an invisible front, a battleground existing not in physical space, but in some terrifying, energetic dimension, pervading every inch of the land. And then, the revelation that truly chilled him to the bone. Each attack point on this horrifying map was connected not merely to a death, but, in an almost unbearable twist, to the simultaneous birth of a child within a specifically targeted family. This was the crucial, sickening detail, the one the agency, in its willful blindness, had utterly failed to see or perhaps refused to acknowledge. The werewolves were not simply hunting the living, preying on random individuals. They were, with a chilling, cold-blooded precision, monitoring the births, tracking the emergence of new lives from predetermined bloodlines. He delved deeper into the older scanned documents within the Black Files. There he found cryptic references to ancient prophecies, echoes of Native American tribal legends that spoke of shapeshifters and dark omens, strange forgotten rituals, and even obscure European folios, some translated from crumbling Latin, others from archaic German. All of them, in their disparate languages and cultures, converged on a terrifying common theme: a specific line of blood, an awakening evil, and mysterious keepers whose role it was to maintain a delicate, cosmic balance in the world. As he painstakingly pieced together these disparate fragments of knowledge, a horrifying picture formed in Alex's mind. He understood that the werewolves were not attacking humanity indiscriminately. Their targets were not just people in general, but rather those individuals who carried within them something, a specific genetic marker, a dormant virus of unimaginable power, or an insidious predisposition that, given the right circumstances, awakened and transformed its host into something truly monstrous, a corrupted version of their own kind, threatening the very fabric of existence. And then came the ultimate, most devastating blow, delivered by a series of meticulously hidden sub-files within the Black Archive. There lay the irrefutable evidence of secret experiments, conducted not by unknown entities, but by humans themselves, centuries ago. Greed, the eternal flaw of mankind, had driven them to attempt to manipulate this line of blood for their own nefarious ends, seeking power, immortality, or some twisted form of genetic superiority. This, Alex realized with a crushing, soul-deep despair, was the primal original cause of everything. Human hubris, human avarice, had birthed the monsters, had seeded the very horror that now plagued their world. Alex felt his world, his carefully constructed reality, shatter and crumble around him. His head spun, a vertiginous assault on his senses, as the full, unvarnished truth unfurled itself. These were not merely monsters and victims. This was something far more profound, ancient, and terrifying than he could ever have imagined. Humanity, in its arrogant ignorance, had not merely failed to understand. It had been utterly blind to its own fundamental original mistake, a catastrophic error that had set in motion a multi-generational, self-perpetuating cycle of horror. The monsters were merely the consequence. The horror descended upon Alex Morgan like a suffocating shroud, a realization so profound and devastating it threatened to tear his sanity into a million ragged pieces. He understood now, with a clarity that felt like a burning brand on his soul, that the Federal Agency for Anomalous Threats, with all its formidable resources, its cadre of heroic agents, and its sincerely held, albeit tragically misguided intentions, had spent its entire existence operating under a catastrophically distorted premise. They had believed, with an unwavering certainty, that they were protecting humanity from monstrous beasts. But their understanding, their entire worldview, had been a warped, funhouse mirror reflecting a grotesque, inverted reality. The agency had prided itself on its successes, issuing reports with a triumphant flourish about lives saved and threats neutralized. The language was always one of heroism, of noble sacrifice in the face of unspeakable evil. Yet Alex now knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that these saved individuals were innocent victims only in the agency's myopic view. In truth, they were carriers, walking repositories of the very plague the werewolves sought to contain. Individuals who, in a chilling irony, needed to be stopped for the greater good. The victims, those whose mutilated bodies Alex had once meticulously catalogued in the beast dossiers, had often displayed strange, disturbing signs of mutation. The agency had dutifully recorded these anomalies, chalking them up as post-mortem changes or peculiar characteristics of the victims. They had described odd bone structures, unusual tissue degradation, even subtle shifts in cranial density. But never, not once, had they dared to connect these observations to anything larger, anything systemic. Now, Alex understood with a chilling, undeniable certainty that these were the nascent signs of transformation, the early stages of a gruesome metamorphosis. These were not just victims, they were future werewolves, their full terrifying change only a matter of time. Every single time the agency had saved one of these carriers, every successful intervention, every brave agent who had fought off a werewolf attack, they had unwittingly perpetuated the very horror they sought to eradicate. They had interrupted a brutal but necessary natural cycle, allowing the curse to entrench itself further, to spread its insidious tendrils deeper into the human gene pool, passed down through generations. They were not fighting the problem. They were exacerbating it, unwittingly creating more and more threats for the very humanity they were sworn to protect. It was a vicious, self-defeating loop, a tragic dance of ignorance. He recalled with a fresh wave of nausea records of miraculous salvations from past centuries, tales of groups of local hunters or military detachments valiantly repelling werewolf attacks on isolated villages. In every single such saved family, the curse, judging by the patterns he now understood, had continued to manifest, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of horror, an endless, generational nightmare. Their heroism, he now saw, had been an act of devastating long-term harm. An ethical collapse, a profound moral dilemma, tore through Alex's very core. Everything he had believed, every principle he had held sacred, every ounce of pride he had taken in his work shattered. He understood now that the werewolves were not villains, not the embodiment of evil, but something far more chilling. They were sanitarians, grim reapers maintaining a balance humanity refused to acknowledge. All he had believed was a meticulously constructed lie, and his own past heroism, nothing more than a potent, destructive force. Alex felt his sanity begin to fray, the edges of his mind blurring into a terrifying, kaleidoscopic chaos. He saw the faces of the people he had saved, the names from his old dossiers, knowing now that he had, in his ignorance, condemned them to a far more terrifying fate. He had doomed them to become the very thing he fought against, a monster in human skin, or ensured they would become the victims of the next inevitable brutal sanitary culling. The guilt, a crushing, unbearable weight, settled upon him, threatening to drag him down into the abyss of absolute despair. The protector, he realized, had been the enabler. The true blood-chilling truth, a grotesque tapestry woven from centuries of ignorance and horror, had finally unfurled itself completely before Alex. The werewolves were not the chaotic killers he had been taught to believe, not blind, ravening beasts driven by instinct alone. They were, in an inversion that twisted his stomach into knots, the sanitarians of humanity. They were, in their own terrifying, brutal way, the protectors, meticulously, relentlessly, destroying those who carried within them their own cursed blood, a dormant, insidious contagion that left unchecked corrupted humankind and transformed them into monsters, a plague threatening all life on Earth. Their actions, Alex now understood with a profound, soul-deep dread, were dictated not by malice or hunger, but by an ancient, terrible pact and a primal instinct for self-preservation. Their gruesome mission was to prevent the unchecked spread of a genetic infection, a monstrous transformation that would inevitably turn the entire world into a desolate battlefield, utterly shattering the delicate balance between species. This was their heavy, terrible burden, their thankless task in a world that reviled them. The agency, the vast bureaucratic edifice he had served with such pride, instead of genuinely battling evil, had for generations inadvertently hindered a brutal but necessary form of natural selection. It had tragically mistaken sacrifice for hunt, a terrifying, necessary cure for a random, meaningless disease. They were blind pawns, mere puppets in a centuries-long cosmic war, unwittingly playing on the side of the sick, utterly unaware of the true scale of the existential threat they were so foolishly perpetuating. Alex's mind reeled with the horrifying paradox. Humanity, in its desperate self-serving attempt to protect itself from a perceived enemy, had created a system, the Federal Agency for Anomalous Threats, that actively facilitated the spread of the very infection the werewolves were so desperately trying to stop. The protectors, in this grotesque inversion of reality, were the unwitting destroyers, while the monsters reviled and hunted were in fact the grim, sorrowful saviors. This was not hatred, he realized, his own heart feeling like a cold, hollow drum in his chest. This was not the ravenous hunger of a predator. This was a bitter, agonizing necessity. The werewolves did not enjoy their gruesome task. They were compelled to do it, forced to commit unspeakable acts to prevent something far, far worse. A full-blown outbreak, a global pandemic of monstrous transformation that would consume all of humanity, turning them into a species of self-devouring nightmares. A profound, soul-crushing sense of betrayal washed over Alex, a sickening wave of disillusionment with the entire system in which he had so fervently served. He had been a willing, if unwitting, participant in a colossal lie, a nameless cog in a machine that had been working against the true good, against the very survival of his species. He himself had become part of the problem, a complicit agent in the slow, insidious spread of the curse. Now, he knew the truth, and with it came the agonizing, existential horror of an impossible choice. He was confronted by a moral abyss, a precipice from which there was no easy path. He had to decide. Reveal the truth to a world that would undoubtedly reject him, label him insane, and ultimately turn against him with a ferocity born of fear. Or, in the most terrifying twist of all, join the very monsters he once hunted, aligning himself with the werewolves as their reluctant, perhaps even cursed ally in this secret, endless war. His role in this ancient conflict remained utterly undefined. He was a victim, marked for an inevitable end. He was a carrier, unknowingly perpetuating the horror. He was, somehow, a judge forced to make a decision that carried the weight of millennia. He was lost adrift in a sea of unspeakable truth. Alex sat hunched in his dark, cramped apartment, the air heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the stale scent of desperation. The only light emanated from the laptop screen before him, its pallid glow illuminating his haggard face, a specter in the encroaching gloom. The laptop, its fan a low, persistent whir, was his only listener, his silent confessor. He was writing his testament, a desperate final warning to a world that would likely never hear it. Each word, each tortured sentence, was wrenched from him with an almost superhuman effort, his fingers trembling with exhaustion and the unbearable weight of the truth. "We were wrong," he typed, the characters stark against the black background. "The agency did not understand. The enemy is not the werewolves. The enemy is inside us. They merely clean the ranks." This was not for his former superiors, those men and women cloaked in their comforting illusions of order. This was not for a court of law which would dismiss him as a raving madman. This was for those who perhaps someday in some unimaginable future might stumble upon his digital trace, his fragmented records, and perhaps understand. This was his legacy, his desperate final warning, his last agonizing attempt to leave a trace of truth in a world drowning in lies. He felt the precious, finite minutes of his life bleeding away, each tick of the clock a countdown to an unknown, inevitable end. As his trembling fingers navigated the keyboard, his gaze drifted to an old, framed family photograph on his cluttered bedside table. It was a faded, sepia-toned image of his parents, his grandmother, his grandfather, all smiling with a distant, almost innocent charm. He remembered their strange habits, their rare, often unexplained illnesses, the sudden, almost uncontrolled flashes of anger that would erupt from them, temperamental storms that he had, in his blissful ignorance, always dismissed as quirks of personality, as mere temperament. Now, in the terrifying light of his newfound knowledge, he saw in those memories something sinister, something chillingly premonitory. He saw the subtle hints of the curse, the faint, almost imperceptible signs of the carrier. With hands that shook so violently the laptop screen blurred, Alex scrolled through the old reports he had managed to salvage, his precious trove of damning evidence. He scanned the lists of surnames, the endless genealogies, the families that had been meticulously marked as targets, as carriers, as those who must be eliminated by the ancient, merciless sanitarians. And then his breath hitched. His eyes, wide with a dawning, soul-shattering horror, locked onto a familiar name, stark and utterly undeniable amidst the litany of the doomed. His own name, his family name, Morgan. An unbelievable, bone-chilling terror lanced through him, rooting him to his seat. He was a carrier. He was one of them. He was one of those the werewolves had been hunting for centuries, one of those marked for elimination. His entire life, every choice, every path, had been an unwitting preparation for this final, gruesome purpose. He, the hunter, the analyst, the protector of humanity, was in fact the future threat, the dormant monster they must eradicate. He was part of the very thing he had so fiercely, so naively fought against. Suddenly, in the profound, dead silence that had descended upon his small apartment, he heard it. Faint, barely perceptible at first, then growing steadily stronger, rhythmic, purposeful steps echoed from the corridor outside his door. They were not the light, hurried steps of a human. They were heavy, deliberate, yet unnervingly silent, cushioned by some unnatural density. The steps grew louder, closer, each thud a hammer blow to his heart, until they stopped. Directly, unmistakably, in front of his door. A single, agonizing moment of absolute, suffocating silence stretched into an eternity. Alex froze, every muscle in his body locked in a rictus of terror. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, deafening drumbeat that drowned out all other sound. Slowly, with a horrifying, deliberate slowness, he lifted his head. His eyes, wide and glassy with terror, were fixed on the door, reflecting the faint, pulsing light of the laptop. In that final, shattering moment, understanding, stark and absolute, crashed over him. A single, heavy knock reverberated through the silent apartment,